Hello and welcome to our identity and security debate here on UK Live with me, Helen Olsen. In UK authorities' soon-to-be published research on channel shift, more than 3/4 of the senior officers and civil servants questioned said that they were increasingly concerned about security of the data. And speaking as a citizen, I can see why. After the child benefit disgate a few years ago, can the public really be sure that the government and the public sector as an entirety can look after its information in a digital world? As a sector, we need to prove beyond doubt that yes, we can secure the citadel, and that yes, we can identify the right people for the right services at the right time and in the right place. Fraud, error and data breach are unacceptable at the best of times. In austere times, they're unforgivable. Here to discuss the various facets of security and identity in this digital public services world we are now in, I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Connell, who is the CIO at the London boroughs of both Newham and Havering. Busy man. We have Chris Ferguson, who is the Deputy Director for the Identity Assurance Programme at the Government Digital Service in Cabinet Office. And we have John Stubley, who is the Operations Director and Head of all things security for the Public Services Network, again at Cabinet Office. And finally we have Bill McCluggage, who is the Chief Technology Officer for the Public Sector for EMC. Thank you for joining me. Before we start, can I just remind you that we will, as ever, be taking questions from you via instant message, and we'll be asking for your opinions to have tick the box on the polls that we put up. Please join in. So firstly, let's look at the basics. How do you secure the perimeter? How do we stop this constant data breach and cut off the Information Commissioner's supply of funding from fines? Who would like to take that one first? Jeff, let's have a look.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to do is to work with the Information Commissioner rather than just watch out for the Information Commissioner. We've recently had a visit which was a mutually agreed audit, and it was very, very helpful actually. It helped us to make sure that we were doing the right things, and it was very open and honest. So I'd start there, use them as an ally rather than a serious risk.
John, I mean, one part of your remit is to work out how do we secure the perimeter, especially when things are running over the PSN.
Well, I think it's actually a changing model. I think where we are now is much more about shared services, shared information. It's not so much about sharing the perimeter and building the big, huge fortress walls around everything. It's about breaking those down and about sharing things. So it's much more about monitoring what's going on inside, understanding what's going on, having common standards, common approaches to malware and things like that, so that we actually have more surety and trust about what's going on within the perimeter.
I think you're using the wrong language. It's not about a perimeter debate anymore. It's about an organic activity that's happening, because the way that we deal with IT and the way we deal with data, moving backwards and forwards across organisational boundaries, inside organisational processes, it's not about perimeter anymore. It's about the fact that you should take the view that it's a compromise environment and do stuff which is much more in an organic way. Think about it more as a biological system rather than a physical system with a perimeter.
And I think I'd only add to that it's also a question of making sure government's only doing what government has to do. There's a habit to kind of try and do everything for everyone, and in fact that leads to more complex systems and processes and are probably necessary to achieve the outcomes, the services, the products.
Because isn't it true though that even the best people can have a data breach? RSA,
yes.
One of the security providers, one of the key people in the world in security, they had their own breach recently.
I
That's
think
one of your, it's an EMC company, isn't
yes,
it? RSA,
it's an EMC
yes.
company. And yes, it was a compromise, and that compromise occurred and is now well traced through a series of analysis. But the key element there was what was the response to it. So in real time, how can you handle a compromise, because we're all in compromised situations? And I go back to the analogy of an organic system. It's about the fact that in barrier control, you go into a hospital, barrier control is about making sure you disinfect your hands, but also what do you have in terms of lockdown once you know that you've had an infection. So it's getting much more of an organic process, and that's about reaction. It's about the way that you deal with it, how much confidence you keep with the people whose data you own, and how do you report it openly and honestly in terms of saying this is what's happening.
And, you know, to give a simple applied example, for us, the question is, would people rather have, if you take credit cards, would people rather be paying money to the credit card companies every year to provide them with identity insurance, say, in the event of breach, or would they rather their card company just phone them up when there was a transaction took place that was either out of character or out of the country or anything like that. I think people are more confident in how their data is being managed when they see that there is a quick reaction that fixes the problem, rather than everybody saying these are higher and thicker walls that will prevent a problem from ever occurring. That's not reality, but reality is being able to fix a problem quickly so that it doesn't damage your relationship with your customer.
John?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's very similar, that actually it's about what you can do about it as well. You know, we manage risk. We have to manage risk in this sort of environment. Things are going to happen. You can't stop that entirely. But how can you deal with it? How can you track the fact that something's happened, and what's your reaction to it? And that's what we've got to concentrate on, really, making sure that we can minimise the damage.
We have to introduce a more adaptive process. You know, so whenever Chris was saying about somebody having a transaction that was maybe a bit riskier because they'd moved somewhere or they'd done something that was out of character, do you raise the authentication level so that you have to do something additional to get past the next stage, or do you report it? You know, the classic phone call that says, have you done A, B, C and D in the last 3 days? Those sorts of things are much more adaptive. They breed confidence. More importantly, they breed trust in the organisation you're dealing with.
I think the good news for us is people are getting used to that in their private life, the way they interact with the banks and various other agencies. They're used to having a certain level of authentication for certain transactions, and as Bill says, stepping that up from time to time when they want to change the levels. So I think it's helpful for us that it's not just the way they interact with government, it's what they're doing in their lives generally.
I'm just going to put up the first poll, which is asking you about whether you think that the citizen does trust the security of government's digital services, because I think will it impede take-up if they don't? So this is an interesting debate. Let's bring the audience in on that one, and we'll feed that back in a minute. In the meantime as well, Michaela Levarge, thank you very much. She's saying the fines, they go to the Consolidated Treasury Fund and not to the ICO. My mistake. Thank you. More questions, please, as well as comments. Going back to the technology that is guarding the fort, how can you, if you're talking about an organic system, what technologies can you employ? Is it an organic system that is all about technology? Is it about culture?
It's a balance between both. I think you can put adaptive authentication into play, which is a technology base, but you have to have the behavioural models. It's about, I've come across the word workplace anthropology. It's about how our culture, how our activities, how our reactions to certain things, phishing attacks, advanced phishing attacks, spear phishing attacks, which are very, very, very heavily designed now to social engineering. Well, you can't guard against it, I don't think, but you can react to it in a positive way that defends yourself.
But also I think the key is you start off with the governance in the organisation as new roles like the CSIRO being in place, is having policies, and the critical bit is people. People make mistakes, but you've got to put the right environment around them, and you've got to make sure they're trained and they have a culture which is to really value the data that they're storing on behalf of residents. And don't forget, the bulk of the data breaches are still paper-based, not electronic.
And I think if we put too much technology in place, as we have done in the past at times, people tend to rely on that technology, assume it's safe to do things because the technology will stop the bad things happening. And we've got to get around that. It is much more about the accountability of the individual. And it's a culture change. People have to learn that, have to realise that. So it's all about training as well, and bring that culture change in.
As we move towards more digital public services, we'll get into a situation where we'll have to start introducing the sorts of types of reporting, real-time reporting activity that we see in the banking sector. And that's whenever you inform somebody, and somebody can then make a decision or change their cultural behaviour. But behind that, huge amounts of anthropological sort of type of behavioural change work that needs to be done.
I think there's one distinction that we should draw as well, which is that creating a new generation of sort of digital government services is probably just beginning. There are things that are online, but I would say that is the digitisation of an old school business process. So instead of needing to go to the post office and get a form, post it in, you can now download it and print it out at home and fill it in.
Post it in.
That is not a digital service. That is the digitisation of an existing business process. But I think that some of the products that Bill's talking about, the ability to react, the ability to grow organic digital processes, can work the advantage of government in its products. But going back to the original point, trust is all important. For government, it is paramount that people feel that these are secure services. If they're used to going to the post office, they're used to face-to-face transactions, telephone transactions, to ask them to do things over the computer or even their phone is a big step to take, and everyone in government digital services is very aware of that and the need to bring everyone with us by proving as we go that these are just as safe, just as secure.
Got the poll results in from the first poll. 92.3%, which is pretty definitive, say that it's vital, that trust, because it will impede take-up if they don't think the digital services are safe. And the remainder are unsure. Nobody said it wasn't important. Which is
I think that comes down to the fact that it's been proven already by industry that where the services are fantastic and people feel they're safe, you know, if you're an Amazon or a PayPal or an eBay, people will use it. People will happily gamble online, they will date online, they will do anything online that they wouldn't have done 10 years ago because they feel that the service is right and it's secure and it's safe and they're not going to be, you know, sort of violated in terms of their data or sold a bad service. We have to match that ambition.
But isn't there an issue here that the private sector has always had perhaps higher security, whereas the public sector, there isn't a culture of security, and it's so you might design the services with that, but at the front line there are many, many people that have to understand. There's the local government data handling guidelines, but does everybody read them? Is everyone trained to them?
I have to say, my experience is the private sector have just as many breaches that we do, but they're better at keeping them quiet generally. They have good marketing machines that don't highlight it, whereas the ICO goes the other way to try and force us to adhere to the highest standards, which is absolutely right, and we should. But I am seeing in Newham, for example, really, really good take-up levels of online transactions, and not just the e-veneer that we might have looked at back in the 2005 e-government days. You know, fully business process redesigned end-to-end processes being taken up in a major way. So I think people are ready for it now, I really do.
I think financially, you look at this, you know, when you compare the breach that occurred 18 months ago with RSA, and the stock market share price of RSA, etc., as we went through that process, there was confidence brought back into that because the company was open and honest and engendered a level of trust. If you try to hide it behind the scenes and then somebody subsequently finds out, you risk your trust base. And that's all about being open and honest, that actually, you know, we are in a compromising world, and therefore its reaction, its reasonableness, what did you do, how did you cope with it, and what action did you put in
if you look at Facebook and LinkedIn and the like, you know, there's a lot of negativity around the edges about the way they're introducing how data is shared, but without being quite clear enough with people about it, I think.
And the final point would be, I think that what government has learned or is learning now is the need to be more iterative in how it looks at these problems. That old culture of higher, thicker walls, you know, to make sure everything's safe and secure forever, is just simply not reality. And so the ability to iterate and to understand what threats exist, what new threats exist, and to respond to them, you're never going to stop, you know, problems from occurring. It's how you react to them that keeps trust. You might lose it for a little while, but if you repair the problem quickly and make sure that people aren't let down, you know, and you give them a way to redress the balance, then they'll be willing to come back and trust in the future.
And I think the key is to actually make security actually a benefit, as it is with industry, as we said with Amazon and things like that. It's knowing you can do something securely. In government, it's tended to be a constraint in the past. It's something that's added expense and time to the work, and therefore isn't really dealt with properly. Whereas if we make it actually a benefit, see it as a benefit and to build in, it actually improves our business.
I think you've got to be very careful not to get into too much depth around considering this to be a process. I think there's a value in considering data as an asset, and very few people who handle large databases who look at this really see the value of this material that they hold. Their ones and noughts stored in technology, and they generally are abstracted away from the individual, and it actually putting a value on that data and saying that data is valuable. In certain parts of it, certainly. Some of it, it's not, but most of it is to the business, and therefore protecting it in a way that's behaviourally sound, but also technologically we can make sure we've got the right processes in place and the right reactions.
Do you think that the senior directors and chief executives out in the public sector, non-technology people, the majority, do you think they understand the importance of data and data as an asset and the importance of the role of the CSIRO?
I think the CSIRO is a key role, actually, because as they take responsibility for that role, even if they didn't understand it before, and I'm sure many of them have, they fully grasp now the significance, and that it isn't a technology issue specifically, it is about the culture and the processes and all the things that go around that. So I think that is quite a step forward for us. Also looking at public health coming back into local authorities and the step up that the CSIRO has to do in terms of training around that is quite important.
I think you miss the almost the complete ethos of data-driven companies. There's a huge group of CEOs, IT specialists, CFOs, who understand the value of the data. In fact, their businesses are driven on data, and therefore they can make a loss or they can make a profit. They can actually lose trust, gain trust with their customers, their internal employees, and the way that they handle data. So actually, the data attributes around a company in many cases are well understood. I think the cyber threats...
Does that go into the public sector?
I think it will, as Chris sort of pointed out, you'll be able to really start looking at a new digital service mentality, and that digital service is actually powered on data and ones and noughts passing. Digital is all about that data traffic.
I think for sort of my experience around the public sector with the PSN and GSI, it varies actually how many people have got it. Sort of, I think people are starting to get the message, they're starting to realise it, but there is certainly a variation between those who understand the value of the data and understand the responsibilities they've got and the accountability they have, and those that don't. It's improving, certainly, but lots of people are getting the message, but we need to sort of move that up as a gear to make sure that everybody does understand the same message, because we won't be able to operate across the government until everybody gets the same message, until there's common trust everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Joining up the data. Taking it away from the silos it's been in previously, joining it up within an organisation, but also being able to interoperate and federate between organisations steps up the value of the data and how people perceive it.
So I think it's amazing, this group of people sitting here, the first time the word fraud is mentioned, we're talking about risk. What's the risk? We're talking about the value of data. There's a very simple way to value it, and that's to say the public sector is subjected to, current estimates, £20.3 billion worth of fraud a year. There's a very clear value that would probably raise the eyebrow of any CSIRO and say, okay, well, there's clearly a value to this out there somewhere, and I think that a lot of what we've been talking about demonstrates the need for government, for all elements of the public sector, to collaborate with industry, because what we're all really trying to do here is defeat the fraudster, who's the person who takes advantage of inefficiencies and frictions between systems and processes to make money, either by stealing data from the private sector or defrauding public services.
I'm just going to put poll 2 up now, which is just a few questions about your organisations. Do you have data security handling training, etc., and does your organisation have a CSIRO? If you could just check as many of those that apply to you as you feel appropriate. Going back to this idea about not all the leaders perhaps in the public sector, and as you're federating data, this is going to be essential. How do we help get that message out? How do we engage them with the need for data security being a top-level, top-to-bottom process?
I think there's sort of two key things. One is obviously about the education. It's about making people understand the issue, showing the benefits of doing this, and educating not just the top-level people, but actually the whole organisation, the culture underneath them. But there is also something we need to do a bit more about the policing. If it is actually knowing that they will be if they're not doing their job properly, something bad will happen, or checking what they're doing to make sure we get the right actions from those people involved. So it's a combination of the training and the policing. I
think behavioural change comes with a series of attributes or characteristics. First one is storytelling, getting to a point where people have understood what is happening from mutually shared stories. Now that's about awareness, but it's also about being open and honest, which is what we do. We've been doing with what we call the anatomy of a breach. It's telling people this is how it occurred, this is how it was done to us. If you want to guard against it, maybe you should take A, B, and C steps, some very simple rules. You go out into the current biz cyber guidelines. The cyber guidelines were launched, and an awful lot of people now have cottoned on to this is about health, it's about cyber health levels, and being able to say, well, okay, we do 80, 90%. A recent survey we did for IA12 said 80% to almost 90% understood them, knew them, etc., but only 25% actually tested their organisational response in real time. Now that, you know, that's one thing about doing it and understanding what should be done. It's another thing about testing what you're actually going to do once you find out it's happening to you, either in a fraud perspective or in a network breach or in a public sector health environment.
It's very tricky for the public sector though, because as we mentioned earlier, the private sector has got very good marketing and they can cover it up, distract. When anything happens like this in the public sector, you're completely hammered by the mainstream media, and you're almost under siege on that, which is very difficult to then get people to engage more. I think, you know, they're battening down the hatches.
I'd just say that there are communities of practice out there that are working very well in local and central government. So Information Security for London, for example, a very good group where there's a good trust level between them. So if there is a breach or there is some risk, they're good at sharing that information and raising the professionalism level in that community. So I would certainly recommend that to people.
I also think it's important to recognise what good is. You know, when you look at, you know, this week we've had the sports announcement, you know, Sports Personality of the Year. The awards activity, the recognition of good practice, is part of this behavioural and cultural change. What is good practice from a you know, security perspective and identity perspective, so that people recognise what that benchmark is? Because sometimes you look at this and go, well, I'm doing something, that must be good enough, and move on, rather than saying, well, is it good enough? Am I best practice? Am I doing this in the way it should be?
It's such a fast-moving world, though, as well. I mean, you can only be one step ahead of those trying to fish the organisation.
One could turn around and say maybe we could just be one step behind, might be a better place to, you know, but yes, getting one step ahead would be a very good idea.
Would be a nice place to go, yeah, sorry, that would be the ambition, to be one step ahead.
But you know, it is constantly changing, and therefore that whole area of awareness, intelligence sharing, about, you know, being open and honest, so that people can turn and say, we've done this, it was reasonable, it was our best practice attempt to secure this, but this happened because it had suddenly changed. Early day exploits, a whole series of things that are happening on a day-to-day basis.
We're not single organisations working on our own anymore. That's the other critical thing. We need to be able to have trust levels that go across different parts of government. And so I think the accreditation levels are no bad thing. We got the Information Commissioner, gave us a high assurance rating recently, and that's almost the Sports Personality of the Year piece. You know, that's great.
Congratulations, didn't you?
Thank you very much. Very pleased with that.
But, sorry, you on that one. We should perhaps celebrate that more. We should have an award for security and data. Poll coming in from that. So, are all patches installed as they're released? 30% said yes. End users having regular data security handling, 20%. Organisation has a SIRA. Actually, I think these people had to choose which was the most. I don't think our poll was working on that one properly. I will get back and check on that one though.
Can I just jump in there and say about the patching activity?
Yeah.
Because you asked that question.
Yeah.
One of the main issues I see in terms of that is nothing to do with the technology layer. It's about the commercial contract construct that goes with it. A lot of public services are delivered by contractors. And if you put levels of availability in your contractual clauses that say you need to have 5 nines availability, you'll find that very few organisations will turn around and start a process of patching or upgrades or updates, because quite frankly it takes away availability layers and levels. So you only get upgrades at certain times. It becomes difficult to do. You know, the reason why some organisations are still on IE6, for instance, maybe that they've not had time to do the upgrades because their commercial constructs at the start of this process have been faulty. So
I think this is something we've been seeing as well with the GSI, the PSN, that a lot of organisations are tied into certain contracts, and part of this is about actually building security into the procurement process very early, so as you make sure that actually you get these things right when you're actually going out and procuring things, rather than waiting until afterwards and trying to build it in and realising you've got huge costs for change in doing it.
So, and that's the contractual cycle, and that's where that whole concept of becoming more iterative can be broken by traditional government processes that need to change on the commercial side, because you know, when you buy something and it's good for apparently allegedly good for 5-7 years, and to make any kind of change to it, even if it's for better security, but it costs an absolute fortune because it wasn't written into the commercial process, then you're locked into a contractual cycle that kind of ties your hands. You know, and things go wrong. So it's about making sure we're smarter in a commercial way as well as on a security, technology or a cultural way.
I mean, already we've covered off a lot of issues where there is huge change for the organisation, whether it comes from changing procurement to systems, to changing culture, to engaging with, you know, federated security. How much change can the sector go through that quickly? And where do they focus their priorities?
Again, this comes down to my point about government only doing what government has to. Industry is much better at changing quickly and at adjusting quickly, and government needs to become much smarter about commissioning services, procuring services rather than technology, so that we're not looking ourselves into technology cycles where we're asking for a service to be provided, and that service is maintained and updated and upgraded, and we're paying for that. I think that's a huge aspect of it. So we're not expecting commercial people and civil servants to be leading edge technologists on the scale they would have to be for all the government services. I think it's one of those things where we need to look at our relationship with industry and how we buy in this capability. I think that could be a huge first step to changing that position.
I think local government and central government are probably a bit different in that respect, because we tend to be much smaller, probably a little more fleet-of-foot in that respect. You made the point about prioritisation, because there is a huge amount of change going on to cope with the funding cuts in particular. So the prioritisation, I think my main point there would be follow the money. We're having to look at where the high volume transactions are, what are the things that drive face-to-face interaction that we just can't afford anymore, and that's where we're focusing our effort around change.
With the public health coming over to local authorities next April.
Yeah, and most of them are there already.
I was going to say they're building up to that.
Yeah.
That's again is a huge change. How is that impacting the front line?
It is a significant change. We're having to look at the N3 codes of connections, those of us that hadn't done that previously, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
John, that's your...
We're doing a lot of work to actually align the N3 codes of connection with the PSN codes of connection, so actually the two will be interchangeable in the future.
PSN for
so
health.
so actually, sort of regardless of where you are, you'll be able to connect, and you connect to all other services available across government, because it's all about sharing the services and sharing the information again.
Yeah.
And as we run across that, obviously, the world opens up into the new NHS mail environment. A whole series of applications start to be released. But in real time, I think, Jeff has talked about governance and risk compliance prioritisation. And that's about understanding in real time what's happening across the organisation that you look at. And those things come out of a GRC layer, fed by a real-time data layer that's turning around saying this is what's happening, rather than looking back at historic logs and saying, oh, we must be going back to that point to find out what happened. We should be looking at real-time response and prioritisation, almost in a morning-to-morning basis of what's happening.
And that is a change for us, to be frank, looking at what's going on in virtually real time rather than historic, what did somebody call us up and say had gone wrong, let's investigate kind of approach. That is a step forward that we're having to embark on.
And that proactive activity comes with dashboarding, with awareness, and what the information, from an identity perspective, what's happening with the authentication layers, how many have been raised in any specific process every morning, etc., to handle it in real time, as the banking sector does, the finance sector does.
And it's also about being able to do that across the public sector, not just within an individual organisation, so not just HMRC or a local authority being able to do that, but if we can see that across the public sector as well, so that we can actually spot a trend, something that might not be spotted in one organisation. If you see it happening across 5 or 6 organisations, then there's something going on there, so you can see those trends.
In the banking sector, for instance, worldwide, globally, we power a thing called eFraud Network, and that allows real-time blocking of IP addresses that are considered to be fraudulent, that have been seen and witnessed worldwide, because remember, this threat now, whenever you go digital is global. So therefore, the threat's not just coming from somebody in your backyard, it's coming from somebody in China or in Brazil or in, Turkey or wherever it happens to be, that this morning's team have got together to tackle you. And you have to be as responsive as that in a digital world to be able to say, this one seems to be a bit out of character, let's raise the authentication level. These ones you need to block, because we've already seen this happen globally somewhere else. And those are the sorts of types of ways that local government and central government have to start thinking once they put themselves into a global digital environment.
On that note, Chris, perhaps this is a good time to ask you for an update on the ID solution for government, because that is your remit at the moment, isn't it? Which is exactly the kind of things we're coming on to now.
The first thing I'll say is it's not an ID solution for government, it's an ID solution for citizens. I'd suggest that the National Identity Scheme was the identity solution for government. That was an ID card, and that was roundly, soundly rejected. The idea of the Identity Assurance Programme is to help to provide standards and reference architecture to allow services all across government to develop a way of consuming identities, digital identities asserted by members of the public, in a way that is simple and convenient for them, as opposed to simple and convenient for us and inconvenient for anyone else. That's a very big shift, and it goes back to what I was saying about government needing to be more iterative, making sure that it's only doing what it has to do, government has to do, rather than trying to do everything for everyone. The identity assurance approach is all about allowing people to choose their providers, to remain in control of their own information, and just to set the standards that will inform industry standards, inform procurements, so that people can come to us, assert their identity in a way that we can consume, and that we can trust and industry can understand and use and potentially reuse. But it's not for government, it's for citizens. And that's a really key point, because we're hoping that what we are essentially priming the pump of is an identity ecosystem where the providers of this identity will be the initial contracting relying parties, but there's absolutely no reason why this credential, once established, can't be used by these same people to go to other websites, commercial websites, to also prove who they are, establish who they are. What we'd like to do is take government out of the account creation business, so that we're not, it's not logins and passwords for each individual service or department or anything. We're actually saying to people, you can come to us once, this develops a single sign-on capability, you can assert who you are and then conduct your business with government and leave. This is a unique solution. There's no analogue out there in industry. There's been a few attempts that haven't really taken off. So we have a lot of hopes that it can work for us, but hopefully it can work in a more widespread way as well.
So this is one step beyond a federated identity model.
It is. It builds on a federated identity model for government. But the idea is that we don't want a big single database. We don't want to be issuing cards or tokens to people. We want to be allowing people to assert their identity to us digitally in a way we can trust, using standards that have been set collaboratively across HMG, and that industry can recognise and use and transform into identity services.
Will this be useful for local government out on the front line?
In due course, it will. Personally, I like the model. I like the fact that it gives choice. I like the fact that people can choose an identity provider that they trust, somebody that they already have a relationship with, and there could be a significant number of those in the future. But it is about, for us, it is about allowing people to join up their identity across different bits of government, and there is an issue at the moment that we then have to agree to what level we trust the identity that's been assured by one of these providers to come into our services. And the challenge for local government is we provide lots and lots of different services. It's very complex, and a lot of those historically have come from different software vendors, and they're all in silos. So the challenge for us is to join up the identities across those different silos, so that when this authentication mechanism comes and says, I've got Bob Smith here, he's a level 3 authentication, we're really sure he is Bob Smith, I can say, great, I know Bob Smith across all my systems as well. In you come, because at the moment that will be the challenge, that just because you said it's Bob Smith and we're really sure, is it the same Bob Smith that I know across my systems? That will be one of the things we've got to work through. But I agree with your point, it is iterative. I think we do some proof of concept, we get this working with our master data management capability in a local authority, talking to this engine, and it will be good to get that moving quickly, because the thing is, at the moment we have to prove people's identities to allow them to do online transactions right now. So this is about improving the quality of that proof of identity as soon as we possibly can.
When is it likely to be ready for trial in the real world?
In the real world, well, what we're actually doing, the Cabinet Office programme is doing a series of alphas, so science experiments effectively, that demonstrate with people who are either on the framework, the Identity Providers Framework, or companies who are interested but not in the framework at the moment, to show what kinds of technologies could be used, how they could be used, and also how certain gaps that maybe aren't covered by existing government services would be met. So people who don't have bank accounts but who would like access to government services in order to reach entitlements. So we have those going on. We're also working very closely with the Universal Credits Programme, who are the first sort of named programme who are going to be taking this identity assurance approach. But to be clear, what they are is they're the first go, the first draft of a cross-government approach. And so it will continue to iterate and develop. But what that does is it gives us something of suitable scale to interest industry, to say government is serious about this, and also to talk to a wide range of public sector stakeholders like local authorities, other government departments, to say the standards that are going to be used for this, let's get them right for everybody. Let's make sure that we're not building a solution that diverges or isolates the Universal Credit Service away from other government things. So let's make this the first draft of a cross-government solution so that it's much more easily portable.
With in previous governments and previous generations, government has mandated or chosen one supplier, awarded a contract and mandated. This time it's been very different in that you, as you say, it's iterative, it's an agile approach, but you've also you're talking about creating a marketplace of suppliers. How does that work from a supplier's point of view? Is that less attractive or more attractive than one contract being awarded?
Well, I think when you look at it from my perspective, and I'm a great believer, I would be, wouldn't I? I was the initial SRO behind identity assurance before I moved on to Mike when I left. But this whole idea of this new way of asserting and checking identity in an open industry, public-led environment is tremendous. From a contracting, a supplier perspective, having something in the hands of one vendor, one supplier, puts you at huge risk. And therefore, having that ecosystem and market, one thing we're, at the company I've learned, is really good at is competing, and that competition is healthy. Competition drives innovation. Competition drives cost advantage to the consumer, etc. So you end up with this new way. Now, what needs to be said, though, by government is to stay out of all the nitty-gritty detail and maybe to talk about, here are the standards. These are the open standards we want to consume this through. This is the market that you're likely to get access to in this new direction of travel. And also to understand the complexity of what's being suggested. This is not simple. Identity is only one means to get access to a service. So if I go onto this morning onto a bus, I use an Oyster card. That Oyster card assumes an identity that says I'm actually on that bus and I've paid some money so I can get on it. That's different to turning around and saying my driving license actually asserts that I can legally able to drive in the United Kingdom.
It's eligibility.
So it's eligibility, it's a whole series of things. And the industry is multifaceted. So I think this is coming together under open standards and a vision or a set strategy that says this is what we want to achieve in the mid-term and long-term in terms of the new government environment.
I'll just talk about standards a bit more, but before we do, I'm just going to put poll 3 up, and we have fixed the error that only allowed you to choose one of the previous options. This time you can tick as many as apply. We're going to ask about ID assurance and your organisation, whether you currently have a solution or you're looking forward to using the government solution.
And
GDS
just to add to some of Bill's points, one of the reasons for taking the ID assurance approach is what I mentioned before about taking government out of the account creation business. But it's also, to an extent, trying to take government out of the technology business. If you have a framework of identity providers, of organisations who can help people to assert their identity into government, then as part of that competitive marketplace and that ecosystem, they can stay abreast of technology as digital and mobile technology advances. There are various threshold levels of assurance that need to be met for different transactions. They're the ones competing for the customer to give them the best user journey, to give them the best experience, the simplest, most convenient way to access government services. We are simply a consumer of those assertions of identity, and we pay to play. There'll be a unit cost which hopefully will be driven down by competition and driven down by technology and scale. But the sort of the battle to say how best to do this actually happens in the ecosystem rather than us trying to sort of micromanage the ecosystem and the marketplace. And I think that's an area of huge benefit and is a very unique model in government, and indeed the world.
I think it's a unique model for the suppliers as well. I mean, it's how enthusiastic have the various suppliers been to be engaged with this?
Well, when I came to this area a year ago, there was a lot of disillusionment because of the collapse of the national identity scheme. There are a lot of suppliers who had been involved who are no longer involved. And frankly, the Cabinet Office was set a few conditions of people re-entering into the conversation, and one of them was to have a very professional and coordinated way, a coherent way to engage with industry across the sectors, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring telecoms or banks or retailers or other organisations together to discuss something collaboratively that normally they would compete on, and you're trying to introduce this collaboration because we're all trying to work together to create this ecosystem, but also again to defeat the fraudster. A trusted assertion of identity is something that would be very valuable in the private sector as well. And so we have worked with an organisation that was actually established in America to help them try and answer
This is the Open
this challenge.
Identity Exchange.
The Open Identity Exchange, and they are essentially a neutral convening body. They're not interested in being an identity provider, but they are interested in bringing organisations together. Their members include sort of Google and Verizon and AT&T, Experian.
RSA is part of that.
RSA is part of that. Sort of very large players who again compete furiously in other areas, but on identity recognise the value in collaboration and are willing to work together because of the nature of fraud, of high-profile security and data breaches. And they're like, well, actually, this is a problem we can usefully work together. And the UK government is willing to sort of prime the pump in economic terms to create this ecosystem, to create this marketplace, because we think the reuse and what that will do in e-commerce terms is going to be very valuable.
I've got a question here from Alan Kirkham, Service Director ICT at Wakefield, which is following on from that in a way, is what can be done or is being done to minimise the potential spread of authentication identity assurance protocols that citizens will require to access a variety of services? How many identities and authentication processes will they have? How can you limit that? Who would like to take that first?
Very quickly, and probably hand over to John. It's all about open standards, shared standards, clearly understood standards that allow people to develop solutions, but don't point people at what the answer needs to be from a technology point of view. Standard neutral, technology neutral frameworks and positions are the way ahead.
John.
Yes, no, I agree, and we're doing some work separately, well, not separately, but very much aligned with what Chris's team are doing in terms of the employee, the government, the people within government and the identities we have there.
That's a good... we've just had a question in from Ian Scott, MOD, which I was about to bring on, but actually maybe I'll bring it in here. What is the plan for government identity and access management for staff and public? Are we stuck with password logins to separate systems, or will there be a government identity or federated identity? How will it be implemented and when?
Right,
Ian's keen.
Very much, we're working very closely with Chris's team to come up with a common approach, common architecture to this. There are differences, and we've got to recognise those differences. It is largely in terms of the government employees. There's greater accountability on what you do. We need to be able to monitor what people are doing. We need to be able to have certain trails that you're not going to necessarily have with a citizen. But there's a lot of similarities as well. So certainly we could look at common identities. What we want to do is get to a situation where, yes, you can log in, you can be in a local district council, you can log on, and that will your identity will be recognised across the whole of the public sector, which will give you access to whatever services, benefit services, indeed OEP, HMRC services, MOD services, even if they start creating some sort of shared services. Then and you don't need a separate ID. Now, it's a very similar sort of way to Chris with a hub, with lots of suppliers operating to common standards across that. And actually huge savings available through doing that as well.
There's been a lot of talk of common standards, and there's a question from Michaela here. Does any member of the panel have any tips on where to look for examples of methodologies and business case to quantify the value of data to an organisation? I'm assuming to get the ball rolling and getting people's attention. Any suggestions on that?
My first would be to, going back to my fraud point, the National Fraud Authority does I think it's called the National Fraud Indicator. It publishes, it's going to publish annually, and that gives a value to fraud levels in a variety of areas, both inside and outside the public sector. So if you're looking for a way to value the loss of data, which maybe tells you what it's worth in the first place, then that's a good starting point.
And I would look at the channel shift agenda. We can't afford to interact with residents anymore via the face-to-face and telephony channels. It has to be web. So that's the real value. If we lose the trust of our residents and customers, then we're at risk of meltdown. And actually, this isn't just an issue for government and local government. This issue of lots of different passwords and things being out there and trust levels is across the whole of the internet for all players, whether they're government or private sector. It's not a good model at the moment where we have dozens of identities.
No, people will start leaving their passwords and logins in their wills, won't they?
But when you look at the what's already out there that's been powered by a standardised approach, you look at credit cards and the use of credit cards across various banking systems. So you can go to credit cards, you can go to ATMs, you can use a Visa, MasterCard, American Express online. They have different types of 3-digit, 4-digit numbers on the backs or fronts of cards, but it's part of a standardised process now that's been introduced and based on standards. So you can have many cards, or you can have many identities on cards, but you can use them in specific ways that are based on a standards approach. So I don't think we'll ever get to a utopia where we all have one or two.
No,
but we will
a
have,
few.
you know, a passport as an identity mechanism, a driving license as a mechanism,
I am
or a
getting
card.
questions coming in faster than I can keep up with them. However, can I just quickly go back to open standards, and where do people go for the standards? That's been another question on that. Is the guidance available through PSN?
There is some guidance on the PSN website in some of these areas. Some of these standards are still developing.
Yeah.
And there is the open standards as well. The open standards, I think that's on the Cabinet Office website as well.
The Cabinet Office website.
And I'm assuming that you're sharing the information and progress in the form,
We are.
in the style of the Cabinet Office in digital services.
Indeed, the
Yes.
Government Digital Service website, we blog all the time, and we talk and we post anything we've published, and we tend to publish frequently. There are good practice guides published by
Great.
CESG people can look at. They're in a sort of draft form, or people can get in touch.
Okay.
You just mentioned that
Yes.
GDS and local government are working together with OSX to
Yes.
put on an event in January, which people will be invited along to, and I think that will be helpful
Okay.
to raise awareness.
Okay,
I
well,
think
we can.
if you do go and have a look at OIX's website and actually look at some of the places, you can go into open API environments globally. There's a series of places where you can go and find sets of standards-based approaches.
A couple of questions coming in. I'm aware that we are getting close on time. Ian Walker at Leicestershire County Council, who are the providers currently being considered under the Identity Assurance Programme? There's 8, I believe. Who are they?
There are 7 named on the framework. They are Post Office, Experian, Cassidian, Ingeus, Midex, Verizon, and DigIdentity are the 7.
And are there any others that are likely to be coming on there? Are you in talks with others, or can you not mention them?
We're in constant talks. Like, one of the things that OIX is for is to make sure that just because people have been named onto the framework, everyone else doesn't walk away from the conversation. The framework, again, talking earlier about breaking those big contract cycles, it is an 18-month framework, so that people who haven't come on this time because they're not convinced that it's the right time for them, or it's not sufficiently mature, have an opportunity in 18 months' time, to join the cross-government framework, which means obviously the procurement for that will probably begin in 9 months' time.
Right.
So it's about trying to keep it within processes as iterative as possible.
Paul Jennings is asking, the identity assurance conversation focuses on individual identity. What happens when a family unit or carers need to be authenticated and linked to other individuals? Good question. Very good question for public services.
It's the idea of proxies, and you have several different agendas, because even within business identities, you can have a CFO, a company secretary, things like that. So this is all part of the standards we're developing, the cross-government standards, about when we say a user, which is the kind of broad term for the sort of citizen business device, that may be the identity we're looking to consume. What do we mean? What does that mean? There are several different definitions of what a business is, for a start. And in law, I don't think in law there is a single definition of identity, or identity documents for that matter. There are very few things out there that are in law recognised, apart from for fraud purposes, as identity documents. So we're setting, within a very kind of organic environment of standards that can help people answer exactly those questions, because the providers on the framework need to know what kind of weighting to give to various evidential artifacts in order to say, well, we can provide a level of assurance 1 or 2 or 3 identity, depending on what the transaction is the person is trying to get access to.
It is critical, the issue of family or friends, or even Citizens Advice Bureau, helping people to do their online transactions.
Well, for assisted digital, it's
It's real, it's a challenge now, and it's something we've got to work through. I guess iterative is part of the answer, because there isn't a single definitive answer out there at the moment, but we're certainly seeing it happening.
Paul Jennings is also asking, when can local government take advantage of the current framework?
Well, we're working with local government already to keep them informed. They attend OIX. We have a local government advisory group as part of our programme's governance structure. It's part of that process of saying, well, let's not design it to develop it for this service. Let's develop it for as many users as we can see. Let's make sure these standards work as broadly as possible. And that's not about watering them down. That's about making sure we're taking as many requirements as possible into account from the beginning, rather than locking something in place or creating something and then trying to change that. So before things begin to hard code, we're building in as much as possible.
I think standards are the key. We're not going to sit around and wait for central government to build the adapter into local government. That's not going to be in the time frame that we're looking for. I think the key is to work together to build some of these things, test them out, and then we, as a local government community, should release them to each other as open source to interact with those open standards. And I think we've got to crack on and do it very quickly. Otherwise, people will create a multiplicity of different solutions out there, which won't be helpful,
Well,
particularly in terms of keeping it simple.
I've got a question here
residents.
from Stephen Peacock at the Scottish Government talking about the T scheme. Will the T scheme offer the public sector, what will it offer the public sector and individual user? How do you see this working? How does your team and the DWP see this working? How will CESG and other arms of the public sector involved to date on ICT security relate to this new approach? There's a lot of concern over the amount of people that are involved in this. How will it all come together?
This is not a trivial movement. You know, the UK is leading the world in terms of this type of approach. In fact, if you look at it globally, there are different types of approaches happening, but this is a new ecosystem, as Chris refers to it. I think within a T-scheme perspective, it's important that you get some form of accreditation or industry standard kite mark or something, because you need to work on the basis of, if you're in OIX, you know, that's a sharing environment that sets standards, etc. But when you build something, what is it that you can then turn around and say, I can trust that as a built environment, and therefore position my products on or my services on? And that's where I think, you know, the importance of a T-scheme type accreditation capability or certification capability.
But again, it's about government only doing what government has to. T-scheme are an accrediting body, a certifying body, and so if you're going to have identity providers providing, there are, in central government alone, there are over 650 transactions. If you're going to be putting in place solutions, those need to be accredited. Alongside your marketplace of providers, you're probably going to need a marketplace of accreditors as well, in order to cover that off, because asking CESG to do it all is simply not practical. So it's about, again, I mean, it's about setting standards, about making sure you've got accredited bodies, certified bodies doing the accreditation. At the moment, T-scheme is a well-established, has been around a long time and been in this space a long time, and a trusted brand. And there's someone who attends OIX and is working with us.
And the interesting thing is T-scheme is embedded in legislation. So if you look at the Communications Act, there is a route into legislation through T-scheme that says this is a recognised government and legislated environment under the Communications Act. So, you know, it's an important point to turn around and say, let's not throw out a lot of the capability that we're going to have to build on in the future. But it is a complex array of activities, and if the one thing I would turn around and say probably is GDS, the Identity Assurance Programme, adequately resourced to be able to do this? And that's what it all
How
comes
many are
down
on your
to.
team, Chris? That's a good point. Yeah.
Not enough.
Not enough. You'll always say that.
Yes.
But the key element from my perspective is you need to take a really good hard look at, you know, this being something where an industry is standing ready to help. And you know, the new approach needs to build, but you have to do it on firm footing, so that, you know, as
I'm
Jeff
getting
said.
a lot of questions about the timescales. Will it be available to the wider public sector? When will it start to be available? Especially as they're introducing new digital services now. How can they build that in so that they're not going down the wrong path? That's the summary of a number of questions that have come in.
Communicate, talk, look around and find out where. Now, there's no set answer to all of the questions, but you know, there's contacts into Cabinet Office, or you know, into local government, or into PSN, Intellect, a whole series of groups, or OIX, all working in this area.
So reach out, get in touch with the programme. You can find us online through our blog, you know, through our website, the webpage on digital.cabinetoffice.gov.uk. We read that. It's not somebody doing it for us. That's the team. And if people are trying to get hold of us, they absolutely can. We want to engage as widely as possible. It needs to be a controlled expansion of engagement.
I was going to say there are hundreds and hundreds of public sector organisations.
But sometimes people are content that their view is being represented. You know, if we have a collection of sort of 15 or so local authorities on our local government advisory group, and people accept that, well, if it's going to work for those 15, it's probably going to work for us. And actually, the question is almost always the same. It's about what are the thresholds you're putting in place for a level of assurance. What are the technical standards? When people realise we're looking for a technology-neutral approach and it's all about leveraging the framework and leveraging the market, then basically the questions boil down to unit cost. You know, what's it going to cost us?
It's cost and when are the two big questions I keep hearing. When can I get
cost,
it?
when, and
Because if
what?
it's not soon enough, I've got to build my own. Yeah, a degree of what is it and what it costs. Because at the moment, the cost is a big unknown, and I think the standards approach, the fact that you're going for scalability with some big transactions, the multiplicity of suppliers will all help the cost, but it's still an unknown. And can I just give a plug for Socketon? We are actively engaging.
I was about to say, because you represent Socketon in the London branch, don't you? So,
yes, I do. And so, if people are asking and want to have discussions around that, Socketon membership are generally quite well aware of what's going on, but also we're producing some guidance to kind of share our view of our overall position on it. So that will be published pretty soon, and that will hopefully be helpful.
And that will include all the information around Chris's programmes and John's programmes. So
that's the intention.
Very useful to pull it all together.
It was a very positive stream at the Socketon 2012
yes,
conference
it was,
recently.
it?
There was identity assurance built in to that. So I would point
it's definitely one of the hot
towards
topics, and I think there is almost a dearth of there isn't enough information out there, and yes, I think that'd be very valuable for frontline services to pull that together.
I think one of the things that's very important is what often has happened historically is government goes away, squirrels away, people work at desks very hard, and they come out and say, here's the answer. What we're trying to do is engage with everybody to develop the answer, which means some people get frustrated and say, well, how does it work, and when's it going to happen? But we're saying, well, actually, it works. It's going to work how we collectively are going to make it work. That is a new and a challenging way to try and do things in the Cabinet Office, but it's in the Cabinet Office so we can lead a cross-government approach.
Can I just make an observation that identity assurance isn't an end in its own right?
Exactly.
But actually it's there to support digital by default and a move and shift in service delivery. It's only one of the parts of that, and therefore, to say, well, okay, this is the answer. Actually, the answer is digital.
Correct.
Route and the mechanism to get there is actually one of them is identity assurance program.
Definitely one that needs to be fixed, though.
Correct.
I'm just waiting for the final poll results to come through, and they're not coming through to me at the moment, so that may be our connection. But if not, any final comments on identity and security? Have we answered the when issue, the when question?
I don't think there is an answer at the moment. We're building it as we go along. But as I say, it's about having a conversation with people that are involved in that. And if we had to put tactical solutions in place, let's share best practice around those as well.
I think it's important people understand it's not a big bang answer. It's not that on this day there will be a solution that you use. It will be a constantly evolving discussion, debate. There will be a point where the standards are, the first sort of proper set of standards are there. The framework already exists. So for this point on, it's about what stage are people at in the delivery of their services? Can they hook in now? Is it too soon? Or will it be too late? We'll have to catch them next time as this contractual cycle comes around again. But the key is that government's committed to this approach. So over time, everyone will migrate across to this approach.
And there are vehicles through which that's going to be done. Universal credits, government gateway, nobody's mentioned that, but sitting in the background, which will be migrating at the end of... Well, it is, and the contract comes up for renewal in 2014, I think it is, or somewhere around then. So all of that are vehicles through which implementation at the central government side is going to happen, and then obviously the local government. You've got a series of projects ongoing that feature trying to align with it.
I think for local government and for the PSN, there is a critical event with public health going over to local government.
There is, yeah.
And I think that's going to focus the minds in a very short timescale.
I think coming back to the identity thing, I think as well, one key thing to remember is it's not just about the technology still. It's also about the culture. It's about the fact that having an assertion of an identity, there is still identity fraud out there. There's still who is that person, how do we protect against that? There's an accountability on every individual to actually protect their identity.
And there are mistakes as well as fraud. I mean, it's data quality we've got to address in a big way to make sure that the identities are consistent and people's data is consistent. And actually, on a plus side, one of the things we can do as we get more confident about who people are online, we can publish more of the information we hold about them so they can see what we store in government, and that should help with trust levels.
I come back to the fact that you did it on your laptop, on your iPad there. You changed the voting, or somebody in the back, in real time to be able to bring on real-time voting.
Only now I have lost the connection.
But
in real time.
In real time.
But you've got to understand that this is now moving from a let's look at this over weeks, days, months, years to a
let's look at it now.
Operationally, digital by default will need to build identity in an operational layer that is in real time, and data analytics, the real environment that's coming through this, needs to be balanced in terms of how identity is shared and intelligence is shared across operational systems.
And while it might seem counterintuitive, that will actually cost less money.
Well, I think
In time.
it will in
At
time.
the start.
I think it's good, yes. And money is always the big issue at the moment in the public sector. Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us in the debate. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope that you've enjoyed it joining us virtually as well. Hopefully you'll join us next year and that you'll have a very good Christmas and New Year. All the best to you and yours from all of us here. And we'll be kicking off in the new year with a big data debate, which will be on the 15th of January. So keep a lookout for that, and we hope that you'll join us then.